In the dark waters of the Pacific Ocean during the spring of 1942, a single mistake in encryption would change the course of naval warfare forever. Deep beneath the waves of secrecy and coded messages, one small error would unravel the entire strategic position of the Japanese Imperial Navy, exposing their most ambitious operation and leading to one of the most decisive battles in World War II. This is not just a story about technology or warfare, but about human error, brilliant code breaking, and how a few simple letters typed incorrectly would seal the fate of thousands of sailors and aircraft carriers worth millions of dollars in military investment. The encryption error was so subtle that it seemed meaningless at first, yet it would expose an entire fleet sailing toward what they believed would be a surprise attack that could win them control of the Pacific. What the Japanese commanders did not know was that their secret messages were being read by American cryptanalysts who had been desperately trying to break their naval codes for months. The error would provide the final piece of evidence needed to predict exactly where and when the Japanese would strike, transforming what should have been a devastating surprise into a carefully prepared ambush that would turn the tide of the entire war. When the Second World War erupted across the Pacific in December 1941, both the United States and Japan understood that controlling information was just as important as controlling ships and aircraft. The Japanese military had developed what they believed was an unbreakable encryption system called JN-25, a complex naval code that used thousands of five-digit number groups combined with an additive cipher to disguise the true meaning of every message sent between their ships and command centers. Japanese communication officers were trained extensively in the proper use of these codes, spending months memorizing procedures and practicing the careful encryption of messages that would coordinate their fleet movements across thousands of miles of ocean. Every message had to be encoded twice, first converting the actual words into number groups from a codebook, then adding another layer of five-digit numbers from additive tables to further disguise the content, making it appear as random gibberish to anyone who intercepted the radio transmission. The Americans had established a signals intelligence operation called Station Hypo in Hawaii, where a dedicated team of cryptanalysts worked around the clock in a basement facility trying to crack these Japanese naval codes. These code breakers were not soldiers in the traditional sense, but mathematicians, linguists, musicians, and puzzle enthusiasts who had been recruited because of their exceptional ability to see patterns where others saw only chaos. The work was exhausting and often seemed hopeless, as breaking just a single message might take days or weeks of analysis. And by the time they succeeded, the information was often too old to be useful for military planning. Leading the American code-breaking effort at Station Hypo was Commander Joseph Rochefort, a brilliant naval officer who had devoted his career to understanding Japanese language and communications. Rochefort was an unusual figure in the military establishment, often working in a bathrobe and slippers in the basement facility, because he found traditional uniforms uncomfortable during the long shifts that sometimes stretched beyond 20 hours at a time. He had studied Japanese in Tokyo during the 1920s and possessed an almost intuitive understanding of how Japanese officers thought and communicated, which gave him advantages that pure mathematical analysis alone could never provide. By early 1942, Rochefort and his team had made significant progress in breaking portions of JN-25, recovering perhaps 20% of the messages they intercepted, which was enough to give glimpses into Japanese planning, but not enough to provide complete intelligence about their intentions. The Japanese changed their additive tables regularly, usually every few months, which meant that the code breakers had to start much of their work over repeatedly, racing against time to recover enough of the new system before it changed again. Rochefort had noticed something troubling in the intercepted messages during April 1942, as the volume of radio traffic increased dramatically and references to a major operation began appearing with greater frequency. The The Japanese were clearly planning something significant, but the messages referred to the target location only as AF, a two-letter designation that could have meant anywhere in the vast Pacific theater of operations. Determining what AF meant became the obsession of Station Hypo throughout April and early May of 1942, as the intelligence suggested that whatever operation the Japanese were planning, it would be massive and potentially devastating if it succeeded. Rochefort personally believed that AF referred to Midway Island, a tiny atoll northwest of Hawaii that served as an American outpost and airfield in the Central Pacific. But other intelligence officers in Washington disagreed and thought AF might indicate an attack on Hawaii itself, or even the American West Coast. The debate grew heated because American naval forces were still recovering from the shock of Pearl Harbor and could not defend everywhere at once, meaning that if they guessed wrong about the target, they might position their limited aircraft carriers in entirely the wrong area and leave the real target exposed to Japanese attack. The Japanese messages mentioned AF repeatedly during late April, and the code breakers noticed phrases that suggested AF was a location with limited fresh water supply, and that it had an airfield, which fit Midway perfectly but could also describe several other Pacific islands. What Rochefort needed was proof, something definitive that would convince the admirals in Washington that Midway was indeed the target, and that the small American carrier force should be positioned there to intercept the Japanese fleet. The solution he devised was brilliant in its simplicity, but risky, because it required the Japanese to make a mistake that would expose their own security procedures. Rochefort proposed a deception operation that would trick the Japanese into revealing what AF meant by having Midway send a fake message in a code the Japanese had already broken. The plan was simple but elegant. Midway would transmit an uncoded emergency message, stating that their fresh water distillation plant had broken down, and they were running short of drinking water, which would seem like routine maintenance information that posed no security risk. If the Japanese were indeed monitoring American communications around Midway in preparation for an attack, they would intercept this message and might reference it in their own coded communications, potentially using the designation AF when discussing this vulnerability. Rochefort convinced his superiors to approve the plan, and on May 20, 1942, Midway sent out the plain language message about their water shortage, then waited to see if the Japanese would take the bait. Within 2 days, Station Hypo intercepted a Japanese message that had been encrypted using JN25, and when they decoded the portions they could read, the message stated that AF was short of fresh water, providing the absolute proof that Rochefort had been seeking. The simple deception had worked perfectly, but what the Americans did not fully realize at that moment was that they had also exposed something about Japanese communication procedures that would prove even more valuable than just identifying the target location. When Japanese communication officers encrypted the message about AF's water shortage, they made a subtle error that would have enormous consequences, though neither they nor the Americans recognized it immediately in the chaos of preparing for the coming battle. The error involved the way they had encoded certain repeated phrases and the additive numbers they had applied, which created a pattern that helped the station hypocryptanalysts recover several additional code groups they had been struggling with for weeks. This was not a single catastrophic mistake where someone accidentally sent a message in plain text or used the wrong codebook entirely, but rather a combination of small procedural errors that compounded each other when the communication officer was rushing to process the intelligence about Midway's water supply quickly to get it to fleet commanders who were finalizing their attack plans. The officer had reused certain additive sequences that should have been applied only once, and in doing so had created redundancies that made the encryption weaker and more susceptible to pattern analysis by skilled code breakers. Rochefort's team noticed these patterns when they were comparing the water supply message with other recent intercepts, and suddenly, Several previously incomprehensible messages began yielding their secrets as the cryptanalysts applied the insights gained from analyzing the error-filled encryption. What emerged from this breakthrough was not just confirmation that Midway was the target, but detailed information about the composition of the Japanese fleet, the timing of the attack, and the approach routes they intended to use. Throughout the last week of May 1942, Station Hypo experienced what would later be described as their greatest period of success, as the encryption error and subsequent pattern recognition allowed them to read Japanese naval communications with unprecedented clarity and detail. The messages revealed that Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the commander of the combined fleet and the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, was personally overseeing this operation and had assembled the most powerful naval force Japan had ever sent to sea, including 4 heavy aircraft carriers that represented the elite of Japanese naval aviation. The fleet would approach Midway from the northwest, planning to launch a devastating air strike on the island's defenses on the morning of June 4, then follow up with an amphibious invasion force that would capture the atoll and establish a Japanese airbase within striking range of Hawaii. Yamamoto expected that the American Pacific Fleet would rush to defend Midway once the attack began, and he had positioned his battleships to ambush and destroy the American carriers in what he hoped would be the decisive battle that would force the United States to negotiate peace and accept Japanese dominance in the Pacific. What Yamamoto did not know was that every element of his plan had been compromised by the encryption error and the relentless work of the American code breakers, who were now providing Admiral Chester Nimitz with intelligence so detailed that he knew the Japanese plan better than some of the Japanese officers who would be executing it. Nimitz made the bold decision to position his 3 available aircraft carriers northeast of Midway, in a location where they could ambush the Japanese carrier force before Yamamoto's battleships could intervene. The Japanese fleet departed from their bases in late May, with the 4 carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Huryu steaming in formation, surrounded by escort ships and screening vessels, their crews confident that they were about to deliver another stunning blow to the Americans similar to the victories they had won at Pearl Harbor and throughout Southeast Asia during the previous 6 months. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo commanded the carrier strike force, the same officer who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor, and his pilots were among the most experienced and skilled naval aviators in the world, veterans of campaigns in China and the opening battles of the Pacific War. The ships maintained strict radio silence during their approach to Midway, which meant that the communication officers had no reason to send messages that might reveal additional encryption errors or confirm that American intelligence about the operation was accurate. Meanwhile, the American carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown had taken up their positions northeast of Midway, their crews at battle stations, and their scout planes ranging across hundreds of miles of ocean, searching for the first signs of the approaching Japanese fleet. The Americans knew approximately when and where the Japanese would appear, but the ocean was vast, and weather could delay or obscure sighting reports, so the tension aboard the American ships was nearly unbearable as they waited to see if the intelligence provided by the code breakers would prove accurate. On Midway itself, the garrison had been reinforced with every available aircraft, including obsolete fighters and bombers that would have been considered inadequate for frontline service under normal circumstances, but which now represented crucial additional striking power that might damage the Japanese before their carriers could launch their own aircraft. At dawn on June 4, 1942, Japanese scout planes launched from the carriers to search the ocean ahead for any signs of American ships, while the strike force prepared their aircraft for the attack on Midway with bombs and torpedoes loaded, and pilots receiving their final briefings. At approximately 6 in the morning, the Japanese launched over 100 aircraft toward Midway, a devastating force of dive bombers, torpedo planes, and fighters that represented about half of the total air power available on the four carriers. The attack on Midway began just after 6:30, and while the Japanese inflicted significant damage on the island's facilities, they also encountered much stronger resistance than they had anticipated, losing several aircraft to anti-aircraft fire and the desperate defense put up by the American fighters based on the island. The Japanese strike leader radioed back to Admiral Nagumo that a second attack wave would be necessary to fully suppress Midway's defenses, which created a critical dilemma for the Japanese commander. Nagumo had held back a second wave of aircraft armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs in case American ships appeared, exactly as Yamamoto had instructed. But if no American ships were nearby and Midway's defenses remained operational, the island could pose a serious threat to his carriers. At 7:15, Nagumo made the fateful decision to rearm his reserve aircraft with bombs for a second strike against Midway, which meant that deck crews began the laborious process of bringing aircraft up from the hangars, removing torpedoes, and replacing them with bombs, while the first strike force was still returning from Midway and would need to be recovered aboard the carriers. While Japanese deck crews were frantically rearming aircraft and preparing to recover the Midway strike force, a delayed scout plane report arrived at 7:28, stating that American ships had been spotted to the northeast, though the initial report did not specify what types of ships or whether carriers were present among them. Nagumo was shocked because Japanese intelligence had assured him that no American carriers were in the area and would not arrive for several days after the attack on Midway began, which meant that either the intelligence was catastrophically wrong or the Americans had somehow anticipated the operation and positioned their carriers in advance. At 7:45, the scout plane sent an updated report confirming that the American force included at least one aircraft carrier, which meant that Nagumo's fleet was now threatened by exactly the scenario Yamamoto had warned about. But at the worst possible moment, when his own carriers had aircraft armed for land attack rather than ship attack, and his decks were crowded with planes returning from Midway that needed to land immediately before running out of fuel. The Japanese commander faced an agonizing choice. He could launch an immediate attack against the American carrier with whatever aircraft were ready, which would be a weak and poorly coordinated strike, or he could recover all his Midway strike aircraft first, then rearm everything properly with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for a devastating attack that would sink the American carrier, but which would take at least an hour to prepare. Nagumo chose the second option, believing that his skilled crews could execute the complex rearming operation quickly, and that his carrier's combat air patrol of fighters would protect the fleet from any American attack during the vulnerable preparation period. The American carriers had launched their own strike forces earlier that morning as soon as scout planes confirmed the location of the Japanese fleet, but the attack was poorly coordinated because the different squadrons from the three carriers had launched at different times and taken different routes to the target area. The American torpedo bomber squadrons arrived first, flying slow and vulnerable TBD Devastator aircraft that required steady, straight approaches to launch their torpedoes, making them easy targets for Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Squadron after squadron of American torpedo bombers pressed home their attacks with extraordinary courage despite facing overwhelming opposition, and the results were catastrophic as Japanese Zero fighters and ships' guns shot down nearly every attacking aircraft without a single torpedo finding its target. Of the 41 torpedo bombers launched from Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, only 6 survived, and none had achieved any damage to the Japanese carriers, leading Japanese crews to believe they had defeated the American attack and could now finish their rearming operation and launch their own counterattack. What the Japanese did not realize was that the torpedo bomber attacks, though failures in terms of inflicting damage, had pulled the Japanese combat air patrol down to sea level chasing the low-flying attackers, leaving the high-altitude approaches undefended at the exact moment when American dive bomber squadrons finally located the Japanese fleet. At approximately 10:25 in the morning, dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown arrived over the Japanese carrier force and found all four flat tops perfectly positioned in a neat formation, with their decks crowded with fully fueled and armed aircraft preparing to launch. The American dive bombers rolled into their attacks almost simultaneously against three of the four Japanese carriers, and within the span of approximately 5 minutes, the entire strategic situation in the Pacific War was transformed. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey led the Enterprise dive bombers against the carriers Akagi and Kaga, while Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie's Yorktown squadron attacked Soryu, and the American pilots found themselves in the ideal attacking position with clear weather and no fighter opposition as they plunged down toward their targets. The dive bombing attacks were devastatingly effective because the Japanese carriers had their decks crowded with aircraft being fueled and armed with bombs and torpedoes, which meant that American bomb hits started massive fires and set off secondary explosions that quickly spread throughout the ships. Akagi, Admiral Nagumo's flagship, was hit by at least one bomb that penetrated to the hangar deck, where it detonated among armed and fueled aircraft, starting fires that could not be controlled despite heroic damage control efforts. Kaga was hit by at least 4 bombs that turned her entire flight deck into an inferno, with explosions ripping through the ship as torpedoes and bombs stored in the hangar cooked off from the intense heat. Soryu was hit by 3 bombs that had similar effects, igniting catastrophic fires that made the ship impossible to save despite being the newest and most modern of the Japanese carriers. Within those 5 minutes of attack, 3 of Japan's 4 elite carriers had been transformed from powerful warships into burning wrecks that would have to be abandoned, though all 3 ships would continue burning for hours before finally sinking, taking thousands of sailors with them into the depths. The 4th Japanese carrier, Huryu, had been positioned slightly apart from the other 3 carriers and was not targeted during the initial American dive bombing attack, leaving her undamaged and capable of launching a counterattack against the American fleet. Admiral Taman Yamaguchi commanded the Huryu group and was one of Japan's most aggressive and capable carrier commanders, and he wasted no time in launching 2 separate strike waves against the American carriers, using every aircraft he could put into the air. The first Japanese strike found and attacked the carrier Yorktown, hitting her with 3 bombs that caused serious damage and started fires. Then a second strike hit her with 2 torpedoes that caused severe flooding and left her dead in the water, apparently finished as a fighting unit. The Japanese strikes had achieved significant success, and Yamaguchi hoped that he could continue launching attacks to destroy the remaining American carriers, but American scout planes had now located Huryu and reported her position back to Enterprise and Hornet. In the late afternoon, a strike force of dive bombers from Enterprise found Huryu and attacked with the same devastating effectiveness that had destroyed the other 3 Japanese carriers that morning, scoring 4 bomb hits that started uncontrollable fires and left Huryu unable to conduct flight operations. By evening on June 4, all 4 of Japan's elite carriers were burning or sinking, representing not just the loss of ships, but the destruction of hundreds of highly trained aircrew who had formed the core of Japanese naval aviation and could not be quickly replaced. Admiral Yamamoto, who had been following the battle from his flagship battleship hundreds of miles to the west, was stunned by the reports of the disaster that had befallen his carrier force, and initially considered pressing forward with his battleships to engage the American fleet in a night surface action. The battleships significantly outgunned anything the Americans had in the area, and Yamamoto hoped that he might salvage something from the catastrophe by sinking American carriers in return for the loss of his own. But as more complete damage reports arrived, and he realized that all 4 carriers were lost or about to be lost. He recognized that without air cover his battleships would be vulnerable to American land-based and carrier aircraft the next morning. Shortly after midnight on June 5, Yamamoto issued the order to withdraw, and the massive Japanese fleet that had steamed toward Midway with such confidence began the long retreat back to Japan, leaving only submarines behind to watch the area and report on American movements. The American forces, though victorious, were also in no condition to pursue aggressively, because they had only 2 operational carriers remaining after Yorktown's damage, and Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding the American task force, wisely chose caution over aggressive pursuit that might lead his carriers into a trap set by Japanese submarines or remaining surface forces. The Battle of Midway was over, and the results were clear. Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers, a heavy cruiser, and hundreds of experienced aircrew, while the Americans had lost 1 carrier, a destroyer, and approximately 150 aircraft, a dramatic exchange that fundamentally shifted the balance of naval power in the Pacific. In the weeks following the Battle of Midway, Japanese Naval Command began an investigation into how the Americans had been positioned so perfectly to ambush their carrier force, as the level of preparation suggested that the operation's security had been compromised. Some Japanese officers suspected that there might be a spy within their command structure, while others wondered if the Americans had somehow broken their naval codes. But the idea that JN-25 could have been compromised seemed impossible to many because of the code's complexity, and the fact that the Japanese had changed their additive tables on May 27, just days before the battle. The investigation eventually traced back through the communication records and discovered the encryption error that had been made when processing the intelligence report about Midway's water shortage. Recognizing that the procedural mistakes and pattern repetitions had created vulnerabilities that skilled cryptanalysts might have exploited. The Japanese Navy implemented immediate changes to their communication procedures, creating new codes and instituting stricter controls over how messages were encrypted. But the damage had already been done, and the Americans had gained insights into Japanese communication patterns that would remain useful even with the new security measures. The Americans, for their part, carefully protected the secret of their code-breaking success, and public accounts of the Battle of Midway emphasized lucky scout plane sightings and superior American pilot skill, rather than revealing the intelligence breakthrough that had made the victory possible. The Battle of Midway proved to be the turning point of the Pacific War, not just because of the ships and aircraft lost, but because it ended Japanese offensive operations and forced them into a defensive posture from which they would never recover. Japan's industrial capacity was insufficient to quickly replace the 4 lost carriers and the hundreds of trained aircrew, and while construction programs were accelerated and new pilots were trained as rapidly as possible, the Americans were building carriers and training pilots at an even faster rate thanks to their vastly superior industrial base. Within a year of Midway, the United States would have more carriers operating in the Pacific than Japan, and the quality of American pilots would improve steadily, while Japanese pilot quality declined as experienced veterans were gradually lost, and their replacements received shortened training because of fuel shortages and time pressures. The encryption error that exposed the Midway operation had therefore contributed to strategic consequences far beyond the single battle, as it had enabled the Americans to destroy Japanese carrier strength at a moment when replacement was impossible quickly enough to maintain offensive capability. Japanese military leaders recognized after Midway that they could no longer hope to achieve a quick, decisive victory that would force American negotiation, and instead faced a long war of attrition that heavily favored the Americans because of their superior resources and industrial capacity. Station Hypo and the other American signals intelligence operations continued their work throughout the war, achieving additional breakthroughs that provided crucial intelligence for subsequent operations, including the shoot-down of Admiral Yamamoto in 1943, when code breakers revealed his inspection tour schedule. Commander Rochefort and his team never received public recognition during the war for their contributions to the Midway victory, because of the need to maintain absolute secrecy about American code-breaking capabilities. And in fact, Rochefort was transferred away from Station Hypo later in 1942, partly because of bureaucratic conflicts with intelligence officers in Washington who resented his direct access to Pacific Fleet commanders. The full story of how encryption errors and brilliant cryptanalysis had contributed to the Midway victory remained classified for decades after the war ended, and many of the participants died without ever receiving public acknowledgement of their crucial contributions to American victory. When the secret was finally revealed, historians recognized that Midway represented one of the most significant intelligence successes in military history, comparable to the British breaking of German Enigma codes, and that the combination of Japanese encryption errors and American cryptanalytic skill had enabled a defensive victory that changed the entire trajectory of the Pacific War. The story of how one encryption error exposed an entire fleet became a case study in military communication, security courses, and intelligence training programs around the world, demonstrating how even small procedural mistakes could cascade into strategic catastrophes when facing capable adversaries. The Japanese experience at Midway showed that code complexity alone was insufficient to guarantee security if operators did not follow proper procedures exactly and consistently, and that the pressure of wartime operations could lead to shortcuts and errors that would never occur during peacetime training exercises. Modern military forces learned from the Midway experience that communication security required multiple layers of protection, including not just strong encryption, but also strict procedural discipline, continuous monitoring for signs that codes might be compromised, and willingness to change systems completely if any doubt existed about their continued security. The Americans also learned lessons from their Midway success, recognizing that human intelligence and intuition remained essential even in an age of mechanical encryption systems, as Commander Rochefort's understanding of Japanese thinking and his creative deception operation with the water plant message had been just as important as the mathematical code breaking that revealed the encrypted messages. The encryption error that exposed the Japanese fleet at Midway ultimately resulted from human factors rather than technical weakness in the JN-25 code system itself, as the cipher was mathematically sound and would have been extremely difficult to break if operators had followed all prescribed procedures correctly and consistently. The communication officer who made the error was likely working under time pressure, possibly fatigued from long hours maintaining radio schedules during the preparation for a major operation, and may have been inadequately supervised because experienced officers were in short supply throughout the rapidly expanded Japanese military. These human factors affected all militaries during World War II as forces expanded far beyond their peacetime sizes, and newly trained personnel had to perform complex tasks under combat conditions without the years of experience that pre-war professionals had accumulated through long training periods. The Americans benefited not just from Japanese errors, but from their own investment in recruiting exceptionally talented individuals for intelligence work and giving them sufficient resources and support to fully develop their capabilities. As Station Hypo's success resulted from having the right people in the right positions with adequate equipment and command support to do their jobs effectively. The Battle of Midway and the encryption error that contributed to the American victory continued to influence military thinking and doctrine long after World War II ended, shaping how modern forces approach communication security, intelligence analysis, and the integration of technical and human intelligence capabilities. Modern encryption systems are far more sophisticated than World War II-era codes, using computer-generated algorithms that are mathematically proven to be unbreakable with current technology. But military planners recognize that human factors and procedural discipline remain potential vulnerabilities, regardless of how strong the underlying encryption mathematics might be. The Midway experience demonstrated that intelligence superiority could offset significant disadvantages in force size and position, allowing a smaller defending force to defeat a larger attacking force through superior knowledge and preparation, a lesson that remains relevant in modern warfare, where information dominance is considered essential for successful military operations. The story also serves as a reminder that seemingly small errors can have enormous strategic consequences when capable adversaries are watching and analyzing every available piece of information, and that constant vigilance is required to maintain security in an environment where opponents are always searching for any weakness they can exploit. The immediate human cost of the encryption error and the resulting Battle of Midway was measured in thousands of lives lost on both sides, with Japanese casualties particularly heavy, as 3 of the 4 carriers sank, with most of their crews trapped inside the burning ships or drowning in the ocean when they were forced to abandon ship. American casualties were also significant, particularly among the torpedo bomber squadrons that had attacked with such courage in the morning despite facing overwhelming opposition, and aboard the carrier Yorktown, which eventually sank several days after the battle when Japanese submarine torpedoes finished what the air attacks had started. Beyond the immediate casualties, the battle influenced the fates of millions of people throughout the Pacific, as the war continued for 3 more years, with the eventual American victory leading to occupation and reconstruction of Japan, while preserving independence for nations that might otherwise have remained under Japanese imperial control. The encryption error that contributed to this outcome was made by one anonymous communication officer performing what seemed like routine work, demonstrating how individual actions by ordinary people can influence history in ways they never realize or intend when making moment-to-moment decisions during their daily duties. The story of how one encryption error exposed an entire fleet and changed the course of World War II in the Pacific demonstrates the profound interconnection between human performance, technical systems, and strategic outcomes in modern warfare. A communication officer working in a radio room somewhere in the Japanese naval command structure made procedural errors while encrypting a routine intelligence message about water supplies at Midway, never knowing that this mistake would help American code breakers unlock secrets that would lead directly to the destruction of Japan's premier carrier, Strike Force, and the end of Japanese offensive capability in the Pacific War. The error itself was subtle and would have been meaningless without the presence of exceptionally skilled American cryptanalysts who recognized the patterns and exploited the vulnerability, demonstrating that success in intelligence work requires not just technical capability, but also intuition, persistence, and willingness to take creative approaches to seemingly impossible problems. Commander Rochefort and his team at Station Hypo earned victory at Midway as surely as the pilots who dove through anti-aircraft fire to bomb the Japanese carriers, though their contributions remained secret for decades, while the aviators received immediate recognition and medals for their courage. The Battle of Midway stands as one of the most decisive naval engagements in history, ranking alongside Trafalgar and Salamis as a battle where a smaller defending force defeated a larger attacking force through superior preparation and execution, turning back an invasion that threatened to change the strategic balance in a critical theater of global war. The encryption error that helped make this victory possible reminds us that in warfare, as in all complex human endeavors, Success and failure often result from the accumulation of many small factors rather than single dramatic events, and that maintaining excellence in basic procedures and tasks is just as important as having sophisticated technology and grand strategies. The legacy of this story extends far beyond World War II history, informing modern understanding of communication security, intelligence analysis, and the enduring importance of human factors in technical systems, teaching lessons that remain relevant in an age of quantum encryption and artificial intelligence, where the fundamental truth remains unchanged, that systems are only as secure as the people operating them allow them to be.